The desert sun hammered down on the assembled warriors with merciless intensity. Waves of heat rolled across the firing range, turning distant targets into shimmering phantoms that danced in the superheated air. This wasn't just another training exercise, this was the crucible where America's finest marksmen came to prove themselves worthy of the title elite. Among the rows of hardened combat veterans stood someone who didn't quite fit the mold. Senior Airman Maya Chen's slight build seemed almost comical next to the hulking forms of Marine Raiders and Army Special Forces operators. The massive precision rifle in her grip looked absurdly oversized, like a child playing dress-up with adult equipment. Staff Sergeant Marcus Brennan, the range's senior instructor, had built his reputation on two things: his uncanny ability to place rounds on target at impossible distances, and his absolute certainty that Air Force personnel had no business holding a rifle. To him, they were technicians and logistics specialists, not warriors. And he wasn't shy about sharing this opinion. "Look what they sent us," Brennan announced, his voice carrying across the range with practiced projection. "Probably spends her days filing paperwork and making coffee runs. Now she thinks she can play with the big boys." Scattered laughter rippled through the assembled shooters, nervous, uncertain sounds that spoke more to social hierarchy than genuine amusement. Nobody wanted to be on the receiving end of Brennan's scorn, so they laughed along, complicit in the casual cruelty. Maya's response was to offer none at all. Her face remained expressionless behind her protective eyewear, her posture relaxed yet somehow coiled, like a spring compressed to its stopping point. She didn't defend herself, didn't argue, didn't even acknowledge the insult. The complete absence of reaction was somehow more unsettling than any retort could have been. In the air-conditioned observation post overlooking the range, Thr. Civilians in unmarked tactical clothing watched through high-magnification optics. They weren't interested in Brennan's performance. Their attention was locked on the silent woman absorbing his verbal assault. Her hands, one observer noted quietly, zooming in on Maya's grip. "Look at how she's positioned them." The wear patterns on her gloves told a story that Brennan, in his arrogance, couldn't read. These weren't the gloves of a novice. The leather was burnished smooth in specific locations, pressure points that only developed after countless hours behind a rifle. This was muscle memory made visible. "Pull her complete file," the senior observer ordered. "Authorization level echo." The response came moments later on an encrypted tablet. What appeared on screen made all three men lean forward simultaneously. The file header was stamped with classifications that few people in the military would ever see. Brennan continued his monologue, completely oblivious to what was unfolding in the tower above. "In my experience," he proclaimed, pacing behind the firing line like a predator circling prey, "the Air Force produces two types of people, desk jockeys and button pushers. Neither one belongs on a battlefield with a rifle. This isn't about pulling a joystick or typing mission coordinates into a computer. This is about violence, commitment, and the will to close with an enemy who wants you dead. If stories about quiet professionals who let their actions speak louder than words resonate with you, consider subscribing to The Final Watch. We bring you narratives about individuals who excel through competence rather than bravado, where true skill needs no announcement." He stopped directly behind Maya, his shadow falling across her. "Here's how you hold a weapon system like this," he said, reaching down to adjust her positioning in a deliberately condescending manner. "Firm grip, aggressive stance. You need to dominate the rifle, not cuddle it like a teddy bear." Throughout this theatrical demonstration, Maya remained utterly passive. Her body neither resisted nor truly accepted his manipulations. It was like trying to reposition water, technically possible, but ultimately meaningless because the moment pressure was released, she returned to her natural state. That state, unbeknownst to Brennan, was the product of years operating in environments where a single mistake meant death. The only parts of her that seemed fully engaged were her fingers. They rested on the rifle with an intimacy that suggested this wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of her will. The placement was perfect, professional, and so deeply ingrained it was unconscious. This was the detail the observers had noticed. This was the sign they'd been trained to recognize. Brennan, blinded by preconception, saw only what he expected to see, a small woman from a service he didn't respect, holding a weapon she couldn't possibly master. He saw an opportunity to reinforce his authority and entertain his audience. What he failed to see was the tiger pretending to be a house cat. The challenge he issued was designed for humiliation. "All right, warriors," Brennan announced with theatrical flair. "Time for a little demonstration. We're going to attempt what we call a cold bore shot. That means first round from a clean barrel at maximum distance. Target is a 10-inch steel plate at exactly 1 mile, that's 1,760 yards for anyone keeping track." A collective inhale went through the assembled shooters. 1 mile. At that distance, a bullet drops over 400 feet from its initial trajectory. Wind, temperature, altitude, the Earth's rotation, everything becomes a variable in an equation so complex that even computers struggle with it. Making that shot on your first attempt was considered more luck than skill, even among the best snipers in the world. Brennan's smile held pure malice. "And we're going to let our Air Force representative demonstrate for us. Show us how they do it in the world of climate-controlled offices and catered lunches." He expected protest, panic, or at minimum, some visible sign of distress. What he got was a single, economical nod. Not agreement, not defiance, simple acknowledgement that a task had been assigned and would be completed. Maya moved with mechanical efficiency. She unrolled a shooting mat that had clearly seen extensive use, the fabric faded and worn in ways that spoke to its history. From her pack came a portable weather station, which she held up briefly, scanning the digital readout with practiced ease. Then came a small notebook, its pages dense with handwritten data, environmental conditions, elevation angles, wind corrections, all meticulously recorded over what must have been years of fieldwork. She consulted a specific page, her finger tracing columns of numbers. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. This was simply professional work being performed by someone who had done it hundreds of times before. Settling into position behind the rifle, her body seemed to melt into the earth. The transition was seamless, from standing human to integrated firing platform. She made minute adjustments to the bipod, canting it slightly to compensate for the uneven terrain. Her hand moved to the scope, adjusting parallax with the fluid confidence of expertise. Then she closed her eyes and began to breathe. The pattern was deliberate: 4 seconds in, 4 second hold, 4 seconds out. 4 second hold. Box breathing, designed to slow the heart rate and create windows of absolute stillness between beats. In those windows, when the body was perfectly motionless, that's when the trigger would break. The range fell silent. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of held breath, of anticipation so thick it became tactile. Every eye was on the small figure prone on the desert floor. Brennan stood with arms crossed, his expression a mixture of smug anticipation and barely concealed satisfaction. He was about to be proven right, validated in his judgment. In the tower, the 3 observers leaned into their optics. They knew what was coming. Brennan didn't. For Maya, external reality had ceased to exist. Her universe had contracted to 3 things: the crosshairs in her scope, the distant shimmer of the target, and the rhythm of her own physiology. She had dialed in corrections that would seem absurd to an amateur, massive elevation adjustment that pointed the barrel skyward at an extreme angle, and a windage correction that aimed the rifle seemingly into empty space, trusting the mathematics to bring everything together at the target. Her finger found the trigger. It didn't pull in the traditional sense. Instead, it applied pressure so gradually, so smoothly, that the moment of firing would come as a surprise even to her. This removed human anticipation from the equation, eliminating the micro-movements that ruin precision. The break came in the space between heartbeats. The rifle fired. The report was crisp and clean, a single authoritative crack that split the tense silence. Recoil drove into her shoulder, a familiar, almost comforting sensation that she absorbed without breaking her scope picture. Through the magnified optics, she could see the bullet's vapor trail, a ghostly line carving through the superheated air. Flight time was 2.3 seconds. An eternity. The assembled shooters, watching with naked eyes, saw nothing. Brennan squinted downrange, already forming the words of his mocking speech about the inevitable miss. Then, across a mile of empty desert, a sound returned to them, the clear, unmistakable ping of metal striking metal. For a moment, nobody moved. The electronic scoring system, linked to sensors on the target, flickered to life on the large display board. A single green indicator appeared dead center in the scoring zone. Perfect hit. Brennan's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally, desperate denial. Luck, he said, though his voice had lost its certainty. Random chance. Let's see her do it again. Maya's response was to work the bolt action, SM. Uthly ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. She settled back into position. Another controlled breathing cycle. Another perfect trigger break. Ping. The display showed the second impact precisely overlaying the first. The hole in the distant target had simply grown slightly larger. She fired a third time. Ping. Fourth. Ping. Fifth. Ping. When she finally set the rifle down and stood, 5 rounds had been fired, and the display showed only a single brilliant green indicator. She had put every bullet through the same hole at a distance of 1 mile. It wasn't just shooting, it was a mathematical proof rendered in lead and steel. The silence that followed was absolute. Brennan stood frozen, his face drained of color, his earlier swagger completely evaporated. The other trainees stared in stunned disbelief. Then came the sound of boots on metal stairs. The 3 observers descended from the tower with predatory grace. They moved past the line of shooters without acknowledging anyone, their focus singular. When Brennan attempted a salute, they walked past him as if he were invisible. They stopped at the range master's station. The senior observer entered commands into the terminal, and the large display changed. What appeared was a personnel file with security classifications that made several trainees visibly uncomfortable. This range, the observer began, his voice quiet but commanding absolute attention, exists to identify and develop talent. It also, unfortunately, allows egos to run wild and assumptions to masquerade as expertise. He turned to face Brennan directly. You are proficient at marksmanship fundamentals, Staff Sergeant. You are not, however, qualified to evaluate Tier 1 operators. If you were, you would have recognized what was standing in front of you. He gestured to the screen, where information began to scroll. The name at the top was heavily redacted, but the credentials below were crystal clear. Operator designation, Wraith. Unit, 24th Special Tactics Squadron, U.S. Air Force. For those unfamiliar, that's a Tier 1 Special Mission Unit operating under Joint Special Operations Command. They are the Air Force equivalent of SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force. A collective sharp intake of breath went through the assembled group. Tier 1. The quietest of the quiet professionals, OPRAT. Ors whose very existence was classified. The observer continued, his tone taking on an edge. Combat deployments, classified, but numbered in the dozens across 3 separate theaters. Total operational hours, over 5,000. Qualifications include Senior Instructor Certification for Advanced Sniper Operations, where she personally trained members of every Special Operations unit in this country, including, he paused for emphasis, instructors for this very course. Brennan had gone from pale to ashen. He looked like a man watching his career circle a drain. Awards include the Air Force Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, for single-handedly holding defensive positions against overwhelming enemy forces for 4 hours after her team was incapacitated. Multiple silver and bronze stars with Valor devices. She didn't come here as your student, Staff Sergeant. She came as an evaluator. Her report on your professional conduct and instructional methods was due on my desk today." The observer turned away from Brennan and walked to where Maya stood, her expression unchanged throughout the entire revelation. He drew himself to attention and rendered a crisp salute. "Ma'am," he said formally, "apologies for the unprofessional reception. It won't happen again." The message was unmistakable. In this moment, on this range, she outranked everyone present in the only currency that truly mattered, demonstrated undeniable competence. The story spread through military circles with the speed of legend-making. Within days, every special operations community knew about the incident at the Yuma Proving Ground. The details varied in the telling, growing more dramatic with each retelling, but the core message remained consistent: a loud instructor had misjudged a quiet professional, and the resulting lesson had been both brutal and permanent. For Brennan, the consequences were swift and devastating. There was no public court-martial, no dramatic firing. Instead, his orders came down through quiet administrative channels. He was reassigned to a supply depot in the desert, far from any operational training. His career as an instructor, the position he'd held with such pride, ended with a whisper rather than a bang. He became a cautionary tale, his name invoked to warn new instructors about the dangers of assumption. "Don't pull a Brennan" entered the lexicon as shorthand for letting ego override judgment. Maya, meanwhile, vanished back into the classified world from which she'd emerged. For her, the incident was just another assignment, another data point in an ongoing evaluation. She filed her report, packed her equipment, and moved on to the next mission. There was no victory lap, no gloating. The event that had been seismic for everyone else was, for her, simply Tuesday. But the ripples continued to spread. The firing lane she'd used was unofficially renamed. Someone spray-painted "Wraith Lane" on the concrete barrier, a small act of reverence that became permanent fixture. It wasn't a monument to a person, but to a principle, that competence speaks louder than bravado, that true expertise needs no announcement. Years later, sitting alone in a cramped quarters at his supply depot, Brennan replayed that day endlessly in his mind. The forced solitude had given him something he'd never had before: perspective. He understood now what he'd failed to see then. Her silence hadn't been weakness, it had been strength so complete it required no validation. She'd given him all the rope he needed to hang himself, and he'd tied the knot enthusiastically. He'd mistaken volume for authority, assumed service branch determined capability, and confused his rank with actual expertise. The lesson she'd taught was brutal, but it was pure. True competence is its own evidence. The real legacy of that day at Yuma wasn't the humiliation of one arrogant instructor. It was the transformation of an entire training philosophy. New classes of snipers, regardless of service branch, were marched out to Wraith Lane on their first day. They'd sit on the ground while the head instructor, a quiet, thoughtful Marine who'd taken Brennan's place, told them the story. "Before you fire a single shot here," he would begin, "you need to understand what standard you'll be held to. It's not about grouping size or score numbers. It's about character, professionalism, and the humility to recognize excellence regardless of where it comes from." He'd recount the tale not as gossip, but as foundational doctrine. The lesson was clear: your assumptions are your weakest point, your ego is a liability, and the most dangerous person on any battlefield is the one with nothing to prove. The story became a filter. It humbled the arrogant before they could do damage. It inspired the diligent to pursue excellence for its own sake. Most importantly, it inoculated an entire generation of warriors against the poison of prejudice. Maya Chen never returned to Yuma. Her real name would never appear in history books. But her 5 shots that day created ripples that continue spreading, touching shores she'll never see. The impact wasn't in destroying one man's career, it was in elevating thousands who came after. It lived in the young Marine who listened respectfully to an Army medic's advice, recognizing subject matter expertise over service rivalry. It lived in the SEAL who sought input from an Air Force controller, understanding that the uniform didn't determine the value of the knowledge. It lived in a culture slowly learning that a warrior's worth was measured in deeds, not demographics. True legacy isn't carved in stone or cast in bronze. It's the principle that continues forward because someone stood for it when it mattered. Maya's legacy was the standard she set through action. That professionalism is quiet, competence needs no announcement, and true strength simply is. The story of Wraith Lane became more than an anecdote about an impossible shot. It became a reminder that the most powerful force in the world isn't noise, but disciplined, focused application of skill. It's the force that shatters assumptions, humbles the arrogant, and forges excellence that endures long after the sound of the shot fades into memory. For across every special operations community, in every training facility, among every generation of warriors who heard the tale, the lesson remained constant: respect is earned in silence and proven through action. The loudest voice in the room is often the least informed, while the quiet professional changes the world one perfect shot at a time. For more stories celebrating quiet competence over loud arrogance, where professional excellence speaks for itself, subscribe to The Final Watch, where we share narratives of individuals who prove that true strength needs no announcement.